The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood as Ava and Amara walked home from school. The 12-year-old twin sisters strolled side by side, their matching backpacks bouncing against their small frames. Their laughter filled the autumn air as they recounted the day's events, a joke their math teacher had told, the excitement of an upcoming art competition, and the delicious chocolate chip cookies their friend had shared at lunch. The streets were familiar, lined with houses they had passed 1,000 times. They felt safe, at ease, unaware of the patrol car that had been following them for the last few blocks. Officer Thomas Blake sat behind the wheel, watching them. He didn't know why, but something about them made him uneasy. Two young black girls, walking alone, giggling. What were they up to? His instincts told him something was off, though he had no reason to believe so. His grip tightened around the steering wheel as he turned on his siren. A sharp, blaring noise cut through the air, making the girls jump. Their laughter stopped immediately, replaced by a deep sense of confusion and unease. Ava instinctively grabbed Amara's hand. "Hey, you too," Blake called out as he stepped out of the car. His voice was firm, authoritative. His boots hit the pavement with slow, deliberate steps. "Where are you coming from?" Ava and Amara exchanged glances. "School," Ava answered cautiously. Blake narrowed his eyes. "School, huh?" His gaze swept over them, then settled on the bags slung over their shoulders. "What's in the bags?" "Our books," Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake held out his hand. "Give them to me." The girls hesitated. A part of them wanted to obey, but another part screamed that this wasn't right. "Now," Blake said, his voice sharp. With shaking hands, they handed over their backpacks. He unzipped them carelessly, pulling out books and pencil cases, sifting through their belongings as if searching for something incriminating. But there was nothing. "I saw you two laughing," Blake said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "What's so funny?" Ava frowned. "Nothing, sir, just something from school." Blake scoffed. "Right, sure." He closed the backpacks and tossed them roughly onto the sidewalk. "People like you always think you're so clever." Ava's breath hitched as she took a step back. Amara clutched her sister's hand tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. From across the street, a young journalist named Samantha Carter watched the interaction. She had just left the grocery store when she saw the police car stop the girls. Something about the way the officer moved, the way the girls stiffened in fear, it didn't sit right with her. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, hitting the record button. Blake's eyes flickered toward Ava. Then, without warning, he grabbed her by the arm, yanking her forward. She let out a small cry of pain, and Amara gasped. "Let go of her," Amara pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. Blake's grip only tightened. "Stay out of trouble," he said coldly before shoving Ava back. She stumbled but managed to stay on her feet. Tossing one last glare at them, he turned on his heel and climbed back into his patrol car, speeding off as if nothing had happened. Amara rushed to Ava, wrapping her arms around her. "Are you okay?" Ava nodded shakily. "Let's go home." Their walk home was silent. The joy from earlier had been stolen, replaced with a deep, hollow feeling in their chests. At home, their mother, Monica Johnson, took one look at their tear-streaked faces and knew something terrible had happened. That night, Samantha uploaded the video. She hesitated only for a moment before pressing post. The world needed to see this. By morning, the video had gone viral. Monica Johnson sat at the kitchen table, her fingers gripping her phone tightly. The video of her daughter's encounter with Officer Blake had spread across social media overnight, gathering thousands of views. People were outraged, flooding the comments with messages of support and anger. Ava and Amara sat on the couch, still shaken. They hadn't slept well. Every time they closed their eyes, the memory of Blake's harsh grip and Zold voice played over and over again. Monica's jaw clenched as she put her phone down. "We're going to the station." Amara's eyes widened. "Mom, no." "Yes." Monica's voice was firm. "What he did was wrong. We're not staying silent." She didn't give them a choice. Within an hour, they were standing in front of the police station. The building loomed over them, cold and unwelcoming. Inside, the receptionist barely looked up. "How can I help you?" "I need to file a complaint," Monica said, her voice steady. The receptionist sighed, tapping on her keyboard. "Against who?" "Officer Thomas Blake." For the first time, The receptionist glanced at her fully, her expression shifting. She hesitated before speaking. "You'll have to wait." Monica crossed her arms. "We'll wait." And they did. For over an hour. Finally, a man in a pressed uniform appeared. "Mrs. Johnson?" "Yes. I'm Captain Reynolds. Follow me." They were led into a small office, where Monica recounted everything her daughters had told her. Reynolds nodded along, but his expression remained unreadable. "We'll look into it," he said. Monica narrowed her eyes. "That's not good enough." Reynolds sighed. "These things take time." Monica stood. "We're not done. I will be speaking to a lawyer." For the first time, Reynolds looked concerned. As Monica and the girls left the station, the air around them felt heavy. But Monica wasn't going to stop. This was just the beginning. By the time they got home, the video had reached over 1 million views. News outlets had picked it up. People were talking. Blake, meanwhile, sat at his desk in the precinct, scrolling through his phone. His name was everywhere. His inbox was filled with threats. Messages calling him a racist, demanding his badge, his hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But deep down, fear began to creep in. Protests erupted in the city. Crowds gathered in front of the police station, demanding justice. Monica stood at the front, microphone in hand. "My daughters were just walking home. That man had no right to put his hands on them." The crowd roared in agreement. Blake watched from inside the station, his stomach twisting. He had thought he could get away with it. He had done things like this before, and no one had ever cared. But this time was different. This time, the world was watching. The city was alive with unrest. Protesters flooded the streets, their voices rising in unison, demanding accountability. Signs bearing Ava and Amara's names waved in the air, illuminated by streetlights as the evening deepened. The sound of chanting, the rhythm of anger and hope, pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. Monica stood at the forefront, gripping the microphone tightly. Her daughters stood beside her, their small hands wrapped around her own. Though their faces were streaked with exhaustion, their eyes burned with something stronger, determination. "My daughters were attacked." Monica's voice rang through the megaphone. "Not because they did anything wrong, but because of the color of their skin. And I will not stay silent. We will not stay silent." The crowd erupted in agreement, fists raised high. Inside the police station, Officer Thomas Blake sat in the dimly lit break room, his jaw clenched as he watched the protest unfold on the news. His name was plastered across the screen, along with the video that had thrown his world into chaos. The department was under pressure, and rumors of suspension hung in the air. "Blake," a voice called from the doorway. It was Captain Reynolds. Blake turned, his stomach tightening. "Chief wants to see you. Now." Blake pushed himself up from his chair and followed Reynolds down the hall. When they entered the chief's office, the atmosphere was heavy. Chief Donovan sat behind his desk, his fingers tapping against the wood. "This situation has gotten out of hand," Donovan said, his voice calm but firm. "You're being put on temporary leave, effective immediately." Blake's heart pounded. "Sir, you can't be serious. You're a liability right now." Donovan cut him off. "The department is under fire. We can't afford this kind of attention." Blake gritted his teeth. "So, you're just throwing me under the bus? You did this to yourself," Reynolds muttered. Blake's fists tightened, but he didn't argue. He could feel the walls closing in. Outside, the chants of the protesters grew louder. And for the first time, Thomas Blake felt fear. Monica sat on the living room couch, scrolling through her phone, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. Messages of support flooded her inbox, community leaders, journalists, even politicians reaching out, but there were also threats. Messages filled with hatred, telling her to keep quiet, calling her names she refused to repeat in front of her daughters. She locked her phone and exhaled slowly. Ava and Amara sat curled up together on the other couch, watching their mother closely. "Mom?" Amara's voice was soft. Monica turned to them, forcing a small smile. "Yes, baby? Are we safe?" Ava asked, gripping her sister's hand. Monica's heart ached at the question. No child should have to ask that. She wanted to tell them yes, to reassure them that everything would be okay. But she had seen too much, knew too much, to lie. "We're going to be," she said instead, and she meant it. There was a knock at the door. Monica tensed. She rose cautiously, peering through the peephole. Samantha Carter stood on the porch, her expression urgent. Monica opened the door. "I need to show you something," Samantha said, stepping inside. She pulled out her phone and played a video. It wasn't the one of Ava and Amara, it was a new one. A security camera recording from a different day. In the grainy footage, Blake was seen shoving another black teenager against a wall, shouting at him, before finally letting him go. Monica's stomach twisted. "How did you get this?" "A friend," Samantha said. "Blake has a pattern. Monica, this isn't the first time. If we push harder, we might find more." Monica nodded slowly. Blake wasn't just going to be suspended. He was going to be exposed. Blake sat in his apartment, whiskey glass in hand, staring at the news. His face was everywhere. His past actions were being dragged into the light, incident after incident. Reports were surfacing, witnesses coming forward. The pressure was mounting. He reached for his phone. His lawyer had advised him to stay silent, but he couldn't take it anymore. He dialed a number. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar. "I need your help," Blake said, his voice tense. "This whole thing is getting out of control." A pause. Then, "You screwed up, Blake. There's nothing I can do." Blake's grip on the phone tightened. "Come on, man, you owe me." The voice sighed. "The department isn't going to protect you anymore. You're on your own." The line went dead. Blake threw his phone against the wall, rage consuming him. For the first time, he realized he had no one left. Monica sat across from her lawyer, David Lawson, as he reviewed the documents in front of him. He was a sharp man, with a reputation for taking on cases that mattered. "This isn't just about your daughters," David said, looking up. "This is bigger than them. Blake has a history, and we now have proof. This could lead to something more." Monica nodded. "I want justice." David leaned forward. "Then we take this all the way." Monica exhaled. She had never wanted to be in this position, had never imagined her daughters would be at the center of a civil rights case. But here they were, and she wasn't backing down. Ava and Amara sat outside the lawyer's office, swinging their legs as they waited. Amara glanced at her sister. "Do you think Mom will win?" Ava nodded. "Yeah, I think she will." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the cars pass by. Then Ava whispered, "I just wish it never happened." Amara took her sister's hand. "Me too." Inside the office, Monica signed the final document, sealing their fight for justice. Blake thought he had power. But now, the power belonged to them. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back rows, their cameras clicking with every movement. Activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens filled the seats, murmuring amongst themselves. Some held signs demanding justice for Ava and Amara, while others simply watched, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Monica sat at the plaintiff's table with David Lawson beside her, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Ava and Amara weren't there. She had refused to put them through this. Instead, they were safe at home with her sister, away from the glare of the public eye. Across the room, Thomas Blake sat stiffly beside his own attorney, a man with graying hair and sharp eyes. Blake's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists against the table. He wasn't used to being on this side of the law. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the judge entered. The room stood in unison, the air thick with tension. Judge Rebecca Hastings settled into her chair, adjusting her glasses as she looked over the files in front of her. "You may be seated." The trial began with opening statements. David stood first, walking toward the jury with slow, deliberate steps. "This case is about abuse of power," he began, his voice calm yet commanding. "It's about a man who, instead of protecting the people he swore to serve, chose to target two innocent little girls because of his own prejudice. We will present evidence, video footage, eyewitness testimonies, that show a pattern of misconduct, not just against Ava and Amara, but against other members of this community." He turned slightly, looking each juror in the eye. "This is not just about one bad cop. This is about accountability." Blake's lawyer was next. He stood, adjusting his tie, and spoke with a practiced ease. "My client, Officer Thomas Blake, was doing his job. Law enforcement is not an easy profession, and sometimes difficult decisions must be made in the heat of the moment. We will show that there was no racial bias, no intent to harm, and that this entire situation has been blown out of proportion by the media and activists looking for a cause." Blake's jaw tightened. He had hoped for something stronger, Something that would make him seem less like the villain they were painting him to be. The judge nodded. We will now begin witness testimony. The first witness was an elderly woman who had been sitting on her porch the day of the incident. She recounted what she had seen in a trembling voice, the way Blake had grabbed the girls, the way they had screamed, the fear in their young faces. He didn't treat them like children, she said, her voice breaking. He treated them like criminals. Blake looked away. The prosecution was just getting started. Blake sat in his apartment that night, the walls closing in around him. He could still hear the whispers in the courtroom, the looks of disgust, the way people recoiled from him as he walked through the halls. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You're finished. Hope you burn for what you did. He swallowed, his throat dry. There had been dozens of these messages. Threats, insults, people calling him a monster. He had expected backlash, but this was relentless. A knock at his door made him jump. He hesitated before peering through the peephole. It was Captain Reynolds. Blake opened the door but didn't speak. Reynolds stepped inside, his face unreadable. You need to get ahead of this. Blake scoffed. What do you think I'm trying to do? You're not trying hard enough. Reynolds snapped. The department isn't going to cover for you. This case is getting too big. Too messy. The chief has already made it clear, if this goes south, you're on your own. Blake clenched his fists. So, that's it? I'm disposable now? Reynolds sighed. You were disposable the moment that video hit the internet. Blake felt something cold settle in his gut. Fix this, Reynolds said before walking out. Blake slammed the door behind him. Fix this? How? His career was slipping through his fingers. And for the first time in his life, he had no control. Monica sat in the lawyer's office, reviewing the next steps of the case. The community was rallying behind her, and more people were coming forward with their own experiences. Blake wasn't just facing a lawsuit, he was facing a reckoning. We have 3 more testimonies lined up, David told her, sliding a file across the table. 2 men and a woman who say they were harassed by Blake in the past. One of them, a teenage boy, was falsely arrested and held for hours without cause. Monica exhaled, anger burning in her chest. How did he get away with it for so long? Because no one ever challenged him. Until now. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders. She had never wanted to be in the public eye like this. Never wanted to be the center of a movement. But the moment those cuffs had gone around Ava and Amara's wrists, she had known there was no turning back. A knock at the office door interrupted her thoughts. Samantha Carter stepped inside, holding her phone up. You're going to want to see this. Monica took the phone, pressing play on the video. It was another leaked recording, this time of Blake himself, caught in a conversation with another officer, making racist remarks, laughing about past arrests. Her stomach turned. David leaned forward. This is huge. Monica's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. Blake wasn't just going to lose his job. He was going to lose everything. Blake sat in his car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The latest video had spread like wildfire. His name was plastered across every headline, every news station. Even officers who had once stood by him were now distancing themselves. He turned on the radio. The first thing he heard was a commentator discussing his case. Thomas Blake represents everything wrong with modern policing. This man had a pattern, a history, and yet nothing was done until now. How many other officers like him are out there, unchecked? He shut the radio off with a growl. His hands shook, not with anger, not with rage, with fear. For the first time, he understood that there was no coming back from this. He had lost, and the world was watching him fall. Blake hadn't left his apartment in 3 days. He sat on his couch, staring at the blank television screen, his phone buzzing non-stop on the table beside him. He knew what the messages said. Death threats, insults, reporters demanding comments. Even his fellow officers had stopped reaching out. His fridge was nearly empty. His sink was full of dirty dishes. The air in his apartment was stale, heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He got up, walking to the window, peering through the blinds. A few reporters still stood outside, waiting for him to step out. They weren't going away anytime soon. His hands trembled as he stepped back. He needed a plan. He needed to find a way out of this mess. The department had cut him loose. His lawyer had warned him that if more evidence surfaced, things could get much worse. And with every passing day, more videos, more testimonies, more damning proof against him emerged. He picked up his phone, scrolling through news articles. His face was everywhere. Disgraced officer faces public outrage. Former officer Blake under investigation for civil rights violations. How many more victims are there? His breath came in short gasps. The walls felt even closer now. A knock on the door made him jump. He crept to the peephole, heart hammering. It was Captain Reynolds. Blake hesitated before opening the door. Reynolds stepped in, shutting it behind him. He looked tired, worn down, but his eyes held something Blake hadn't seen before. Contempt. "You're done," Reynolds said flatly. Blake scoffed. "I already know that." "No, you don't," Reynolds snapped. "They're coming for you, Blake. The department isn't just cutting ties anymore. Internal Affairs has reopened every complaint against you. The feds are getting involved. This isn't just about Ava and Amara anymore." Blake swallowed hard. Reynolds' voice dropped lower. "They're building a case against you. And if you don't get ahead of it, you're going to prison." Blake felt something ice-cold settle in his chest. "Tell me exactly what they have," he whispered. Reynolds shook his head. "I can't help you. No one can." And with that, he walked out, leaving Blake standing in the middle of his dark apartment, drowning in silence. Monica sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the case files David had given her. Her hands trembled as she read the testimonies of other victims, men, women, even teenagers, who had suffered under Blake's abuse of power. Ava and Amara sat nearby, drawing quietly. Their innocence, their ability to still find joy despite everything, made her heart ache. David had called earlier with an update. The case was gaining national attention. Civil rights organizations were now involved. Blake wasn't just facing a lawsuit, he was facing criminal charges. The thought should have made her feel relieved. But instead, it only deepened her exhaustion. Ava looked up. "Mommy, are we safe now?" Monica's throat tightened. She forced a smile. "Yes, baby, we're safe." But deep down, she wasn't sure. She had seen what happened when powerful men were backed into a corner. And Thomas Blake had nothing left to lose. Blake sat in his car outside the police station, gripping the steering wheel. He knew this was a mistake, but he had no choice. He stepped out, ignoring the stares of the few officers still willing to acknowledge his presence. Some looked away, others sneered. He wasn't one of them anymore. He walked to an old desk, where a sergeant sat typing away. "I need to see Captain Reynolds," he muttered. The sergeant barely looked at him. "He doesn't want to see you." Blake clenched his jaw. "Tell him it's about the case." The sergeant sighed, picking up the phone. A moment later, she nodded toward a side office. "Go ahead." Blake stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Reynolds stood by the window, arms crossed. "You got 5 minutes." Blake took a deep breath. "I need a deal." Reynolds turned, raising an eyebrow. "A deal?" Blake nodded. "I know things that could help you. There are other officers worse than me. If I go down, I'm not going alone." Reynolds studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You really think you have leverage?" Blake felt his stomach drop. "You're toxic, Blake. No one's going to make a deal with you." Blake's breath caught. "So that's it?" Reynolds nodded. "That's it." Blake turned, walking out of the office, his pulse pounding in his ears. If the police wouldn't protect him, he had only one option left. He had to disappear. Monica was tucking Ava and Amara into bed when she heard a noise outside. Her body tensed. She walked to the window, peering through the curtains. The street was quiet, too quiet. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." Her hands shook. She knew exactly who it was from. Blake. She backed away from the window, locking every door in the house. Her heart pounding. Blake was losing everything, and she knew desperate men were the most dangerous of all. The night stretched long, and Monica found herself pacing the living room, unable to shake the unease clawing at her chest. The text from Blake replayed in her mind, each word dripping with unspoken threats. She had already called David, who assured her that Blake was being watched. But was that enough? Ava and Amara were fast asleep in their room, unaware of the storm looming over their family. Monica envied them, their innocence, their ability to trust that she could keep them safe. But she wasn't sure she could. She checked the locks again, then peered out the window. The street was empty. but the silence felt unnatural. Her phone buzzed again. Don't think the police can protect you. They don't care about you. They never did. Her breath caught in her throat. She quickly typed a reply. If you come near my daughters, I will make sure you regret it. No response. She set her phone down, heart pounding. Then, from outside, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. Monica's blood ran cold. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, her hands shaking. Slowly, she approached the front door, pressing her ear against it. Silence. She reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then turned it just enough to peer through the crack. Nothing, but the feeling didn't leave her. Someone was out there, watching. She stepped back, locked the door again, and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would leave town. She didn't care what it took. She had to get her daughters away from Thomas Blake before it was too late. Blake knew he was being followed. Ever since his last message to Monica, he had seen the same black SUV parked near his apartment. The same man pretending to check his phone on the corner. They thought they could scare him. But he wasn't done yet. He had spent years building power, bending the rules in his favor, making sure no one could touch him. And now, just because a few cameras caught what he did, they wanted to erase him? No, he wouldn't let them. He parked his car behind an abandoned building, checking his phone. No new messages. He tapped out a text to a number he hadn't used in years. I need a favor. One last job. A minute passed. Then, finally, a reply. Where? Blake smirked. He wasn't going down alone. Monica packed quickly. Clothes, documents, Ava's stuffed rabbit, everything they needed for at least a few weeks. She wasn't waiting for the police to handle Blake. She wasn't going to let them fail her like they had before. David had promised to help. He knew people, safe houses, new identities if necessary. But Monica didn't want to disappear forever. She wanted Blake gone. Ava and Amara sat on the couch, confused but obedient. Mommy, where are we going? Ava asked, clutching her rabbit tightly. Monica forced a smile. Somewhere safe. A knock at the door made her jump. David's voice came through. Monica, it's me. She let out a breath of relief and opened the door. David stepped inside, eyes scanning the packed bags. You're sure about this? She nodded. He won't stop. I can feel it. David ran a hand through his hair. I've got a car waiting. We can leave now. Monica hesitated. And Blake? David's expression hardened. We'll deal with him. She didn't ask what that meant. She just took her daughters by the hand and walked out the door, leaving behind everything they had ever known. Blake sat in the dimly lit motel room, his mind racing. The scent of cheap cigarettes and stale beer clung to the air, mixing with his own sweat. His phone lay face up on the nightstand, the screen glowing with the latest message. She's leaving town. Tonight. His grip tightened around the cheap plastic cup of whiskey he'd been nursing for the past hour. Monica thought she could just pack up and disappear. Take the kids and erase him like he never existed. No, he wouldn't let that happen. He had lost his badge. His so-called brothers in the force had turned their backs on him. And the world was watching, waiting for his downfall. But there was one thing they still didn't understand. Thomas Blake was a survivor. He stood, the chair scraping against the filthy carpet as he grabbed his gun from the table. He checked the magazine, fully loaded. He didn't know exactly how this would end. But he knew one thing. Monica wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. He shoved the gun into his waistband, grabbed his jacket, and took one last look at his reflection in the cracked motel mirror. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He barely recognized himself anymore. Good. He wasn't Thomas Blake, the respected officer, the untouchable man he used to be. He was something else now. Something dangerous. He stepped outside, the night air heavy and humid. His car sat in the parking lot. A battered old sedan he'd stolen 2 towns over. No one was looking for him yet. But they would be soon. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and peeled out onto the road. His heart pounded in his chest as he checked his phone again. Bus station, 11 p.m. She'll be there. A slow, wicked smile spread across his face. If Monica wanted to run, he'd make sure she never ran again.